Great. Good morning, everyone. We're excited to get started today with our briefing, The Defense Budget and Economic Statecraft, brought to you by the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies. My name is Madeline Field. I'll be your moderator today. I'm an assistant editor at War on the Rocks, where I work on our Cogs of War vertical, which focuses on defense tech and industrial policy. So this is the fifth in our live briefing series, assessing the economic statecraft problem set as a core national security domain. And these webinars are based on our ongoing 11-part article series in War on the Rocks titled War by Other Ledgers. So today we'll be discussing why defense budgets are critical to economic statecraft and how we can more effectively leverage them. So I'm thrilled to be joined here today by Mark Mitchum, the principal at Strat Aero Advisory and a retired Air Force Major General, and Dr. Tim Welter, a senior research fellow at the Potomac Institute. Mark and Tim, thank you guys for joining me.
Thanks, Maddie.
So to our audience, per the usual, Mark and Tim will be doing a live Q&A at the end of this session. So do put your questions in the chat if you have them. And this will also be uploaded on YouTube afterwards, so you can share it with your friends. So we're going to jump right into it. Mark, your article was great, and you lay out in the beginning some compelling reasons why economic statecraft and the defense budget belong in the same conversation. And there are three. Defense is half of federal spending, dependent on industry for capability, and that better military outcomes in economic statecraft will result from a better defense budgeting process. So can you tell us a little bit more about this core thesis and how you developed it?
Great. Well, thanks, Maddie. Thanks, Tim, and to the War on the Rocks team, as well as the Potomac Institute team for the support and the opportunity to both write this article and be here to discuss. I think to sum it up, I would say defense budgets are an element of economic statecraft. That is happening now. The question is, how much do we embrace that, and how much of it is purposeful versus kind of ad hoc of the signals that we're sending? So having lived this for a while, inside the Pentagon, and obviously my discussion here is my own personal views, not the Department of the Air Force or any other official views. I think there's a lot we're leaving on the table on how we align those things. And so as we talk about the broader economic statecraft category project that's ongoing, I think we have the opportunity to refine that. And you talked about the three ways that I think they're linked. Clearly, the fact that half of our discretionary spending in the federal budget is accounted for in the defense budget means it is a large signal, and probably the single largest signal as far as defense spending goes that interacts here. The last part of that, I want to talk about the third one of saying, how does building better budgets, the same mechanisms of that tied to economic statecraft? And I would say that as we look at how we deliberately craft budgets, the messages that those budgets send, both internal to the Pentagon, to our stakeholders on Capitol Hill, and then specifically to industry as well as our foreign partners and competitors, as we tie those together, you have to understand the coherence, and you have to understand what you're doing in the defense budget, how those things are linked together, the dependencies both inside and outside the defense budget. And there's a lot of things we can do better. And when we talk about the recommendations, I think that's where the recommendations try to focus, that you have to do a lot of kind of eaches in the process, as well as some of the systems we use to do it, in order to implement any new policy, but certainly to better integrate economic statecraft. And so we have to see each other, see ourselves through better data systems, understand the linkages between things so that we can do things like economic statecraft and achieve the national outcomes that national policy lays out for us as it relates to that.
Awesome. Tim, you've lived this too, right?
Yes, some of the time with Mark, of course, and again to your point, I'm representing my personal interests and thoughts today, not representing the Department of the Air Force or the Department of Defense in any way, but yeah. So I think this article, first of all, couldn't have been timed better, like given where things are at with defense budgets, right? Understanding how industry can work with the department better, right? There's definitely some signals that have gone out from this administration on that front, right? To move faster, and so what does all that mean? But part of that conversation, I think, is really pertinent in that there is this realization, right, that the decisions we make, right, the coherence in the messaging that comes out from a budget standpoint really weighs into our objectives as a nation from an economic standpoint, right? Especially given the fact that economic tools are used more prolifically than I think they have been in recent history, right? Tariffs, export controls, and such. And so, how do we help make sure that what the Defense Department is putting out, right, as a message? How does that align with those economic statecraft objectives? I think we're at an important turning point in realization, right, from senior leaders that the two are correlated more so. They're not in isolation, right? And historically, I think if you look at and to a certain point inside the building, still too, there's very much probably an underlying approach, right? That a lot of this stuff happens in isolation, right? The approach to the budget, whereas in fact, it really does weigh in a broader manner on our objectives, not just from a kinetic, right, military focused, budget standpoint, but broader statecraft, broader societal challenges, given where we're at in the global stage right now.
So we discussed in the prep for this webinar that, your article depends on a level of interagency coordination and cooperation that maybe isn't there quite yet. So Tim, do you think, before we dive into the specifics more of defense, do you think you could lay out sort of where that coordination, that interagency coordination is now, and what will sort of have to fall into place in order for this to be operationalized?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and a transcendent theme really across this series and across the learning that we've done on, where economic statecraft is, and where it's going, and the practitioners, right, that are actually executing across the interagency and commerce, treasury, wherever they might be. There is a transcendent theme, right? That there's a lot of goodness going on, right? There's a lot of focus on dealing with adversarial economics specifically, at all those agencies that are involved. The Defense Department is setting up this, the Economic Defense Unit, right? They've got the Office of Strategic Capital, right? So they're all doing things. Everyone's doing things, but I think what's still evolving, right, and what the government is still working toward, right, is a means by which to coordinate all that activity toward toward a strategy, right, and then guided by doctrine, right? So we're still working through that. So there's disparate, sporadic, not necessarily sporadic, but disparate efforts, really good efforts that are going on. But there's still no referee, right? Or at least not an obvious one at the very top levels, directing traffic with regard to priorities. And to this point, right, to the point of this article, resourcing and budgeting, because a lot of these entities that are doing this, they're doing it. Yes, it's part of their mission. And to go back to Will Norris's article, right, there's 1,400 entities, right, that are doing this, but a lot of them are doing it out of hide, if you will. So doing it as something that they see as part of their mission that they have to do, but not necessarily just definitively resourced to that end. And this is where the budget part comes in.
If I could add one thing to that, Maddie, I think as we look at the tie here, one of the reasons why I tried to focus the recommendations and the paper in general, in that this change, to way we look at things and the specific recommendations, even if there is not a broader embracing of, say, both guidance as well as the coordination mechanisms in the interagency, they are still worth doing. Yes. And that's why I really tried to bring in the fact that I think they are aligned with helping us build better budgets, because there is merit standalone, but it's also preconditions required to better integrate economic statecraft as the interagency better embraces that. And I think especially the coordination mechanisms.
So building off that, is the existing sort of lack of consideration of these very pointed economic statecraft objectives in the defense budget more a sequencing issue, or is it more of a structural omission, do you think? Like if you write that, often economic statecraft or industrial policy considerations are put towards the end of the process when it's too late for someone to more effectively integrate it into the budget. So what do you think?
So I think it's both,
Okay.
which might be a recurring answer throughout my the discussions today. I like to talk to both sides of things and on the pro and the con. But I think as I look at, so the sequencing problem, I think is the most obvious.
Yeah.
You have a very complex bureaucracy, and I don't necessarily mean that in a pejorative way, but it is the reality of the Defense Department, the Department of War, that builds these budgets. And so you have the vast majority of money sitting with the services, the Army, the Air Force, the Navy, et cetera. Those take years to put together. They're very complicated. There's interconnections between the way you plan to fight, the adversary, and the context within which you'll use something, therefore what you buy, the capabilities you prioritize, and then all the things, which is actually the majority of the money, that goes to sustaining that, to paying for the people, to keeping and building the readiness. So there's all this complicated system that happens behind the scenes. If in the sequence of things, you wait until the end to say sprinkle in or bolt on considerations of economic statecraft or industrial policy, you inherently break things. It's a very inefficient way to do it because you're not actually inculcating it across the broader bureaucracy. So that's the sequencing issue. And that gets to my discussion of the defense planning guidance and try to bring that direction in more for things that we know up front that we're going to consider, whether that be increasing production capacity, prioritizing that early on so the services have a chance to do that and then are held accountable to achieving those outcomes. That's one piece. Then there's the structural side. There's the structural bureaucracy side, which I think is linked to the sequencing that we just discussed. But there's also a fact that it is so complex what's going on. So when you make changes at the end, it's very hard to know how those things connect. And this gets to dependencies, whether that's within a service, across the services, across the Department of Defense, or certainly with our industry partners and understanding that. So that gets into some of the recommendations about, I think, how we build and better understand those dependencies. And that gets to, frankly, a lot of just IT tools and how we better bring those in to make better decisions. So we understand the implications, not just the first order, but the second and third order. We have a sense of where those go. So that's kind of the sequencing, but then just structurally how we actually implement them. They're both issues we need to address.
Awesome. Tim, do you want to add anything?
So I'll just offer too, there's a cultural aspect of things too, right? So what have we done in the past? How do we change status quo? How do you change bureaucratic inertia, right? All the very difficult things that that you have to deal with in a big bureaucracy like the Pentagon. Again, not in a pejorative way, but that's just kind of how it is. So how do you change or how do you make sure that senior leaders that are making the decisions on these things, right? Think, in a proactive way. Like when they first approach the challenge, they're thinking, okay, well, what are the societal level problems, right, or challenges or issues or opportunities that we have to consider, approaching this rather than, okay, what did we do last year? Like, tweaks on the left and right. And then move forward. Not that that's what always happens by any means, but that I think the cultural aspect of things. How do we help each other? How do we educate each other on that front and hold each other accountable to that as you formalize in the process the need to actually consider these other factors.
I know we've talked about cyber before as, a corollary for how economic statecraft coordination needs to happen across the government. Do you think that there is anything that's happened, in the Defense Department in the past, that could, be a parallel or corollary to the integration of economic statecraft? Like I'm thinking maybe political considerations during the global war on terror, things like that, that were maybe towards the end of the budget cycle, but should have been brought up front. Is there a good model, is what I'm asking.
I think we're figuring out what the good model should be. The great thing about our democracy, right, is it's kind of messy, and then eventually we get to an answer that works for us, right? I will lean on the cyber thing, right? So One of the next articles that we're gonna that's coming down in the series actually makes this comparison. And cyber, because it touches everything, right? Not just from a military standpoint, but economics, right? Infrastructure. There's definitive roles and responsibilities, statutory challenges, and all that kind of stuff. We went from being very, again, isolated between government or the public and private sector to we've gotten to a good place that works, I think, from a partnership standpoint, from a societal approach, and I think this is going to be in a lot of ways similar, especially given that the private sector is really in the driver's seat, right? They're making the big decisions to the points in your article with regard to, massive amounts of capital and investment, right? They really are. So how do we make sure that that partnership, that relationship across the board matures and evolves in the right way between the public and private sector, just like it did for cyber, right? It took, and policymakers had to understand the problem and then provide guidance and statutory and policy wise to make it work out. And so I think we've benefited greatly. So if we can learn from that lesson, that model, I think we'll make great gains.
Cool.
I have two quick comments on that. One's kind of an external comment that is clearly more Tim's purview than mine as far as external to the Department of Defense. But I do think one of the issues you get to is the primary coordinating mechanism when you get to these things of national policy that are trying to coordinate across several different entities, whether it's cyber, energy policy, some of those things that have broader implications. But particularly national security tends to be a National Security Council. The structure of that and how it runs rightfully, changes with each administration. So it is one of the challenges here, and I'm interested in hopefully some of the follow-on work, Tim, at the Potomac Institute is doing to understand how do you make that enduring enough over time where it changes to meet the needs of each individual administration, but that key coordinating mechanism on these things that cross administration, how do you keep that in place? I think that's a real challenge right now. I specifically think about how the Department of Defense and Commerce work together right now on several things going on about incentivizing manufacturing. That leads to some tax policy discussions, both at Treasury and with the Hill, and how we make that more than just ad hoc. So very interested in ideas of how you look for examples. I don't know of great examples, although a lot of work was, as done on cyber and some of those issues.
Awesome. So steering back sort of to your article, you in the title, I think you reference the concept of signal to noise.
Yes.
So just, for those who are maybe a little bit more uninitiated, what does that mean?
So, you think about just his most basic level, and I'd say something about AM radio, but most of the audience probably has never listened to AM radio, but how you get the best signal and you can hear it through the noise. I mean, just literally in a radio frequency kind of discussion here, or a crowded room, of people talking. So that's obviously the most basic discussion of it. But if I specifically think about this in an industry context, and I should put my cards on the table that I believe that our asymmetric advantage as a nation is our industrial and our innovative and our manufacturing ecosystem. And that combined with the private capital markets, I think is how we outcompete our adversaries. So I very much focus on thinking about how we incentivize those things and align behaviors that lead to those kind of national outcomes. So that's my prejudice or bias, if you will, walking into it. So taking it from a private markets or a private capital or industrial side of where they're going to make capital allocation, where they're going to make CapEx decisions, and how we want to incentivize that to achieve national outcomes. There are innumerable signals to them out in the ecosystem. Specifically in defense, and I often will use Air Force examples because that's what I know the best, but it's equivalent examples on all the service side. Excuse me, sorry. As we look at that, they get inputs from major commands, they get inputs from combatant commands, they get inputs from different parts of the service, from other services, other parts of DOW. How do they know what's real? How do they know where the Department of Defense ultimately is going to spend money? which is the manifestation of your strategy. I would say it's very hard to know. And who do you listen to in that and try to be an authoritative voice? And that's where the idea of having better signals, and we'll talk about demand signals specifically of where we intend to go as a department, where the department intends to spend money, is incredibly important. And then reducing the noise by just helping people focus, by reducing the number of voices to some degree. There's always should be a competition of ideas, right? That's part of that's a feature, not a glitch in our system. But at the same time, folks are able to decipher, to understand, and make their best decisions, whether that be based on return on capital, return on investment, or just business strategy to align that. So that's how I kind of think about the problem from that. What does this look like to industry?
Yeah, you cite that fascinating, 10 to 1 example that for every $1 billion of funded priority, there are 10 billion in unfunded priorities. So what do you think are some, steps that in the next couple of months as the department starts to craft its, what is that now, FY 2028 budget?
Yes.
What can they be doing to cut through that noise, as you said?
So many things. First off, there are a lot of good things going on. So I do want to say, and Tim mentioned some of those, the Office of Strategic Capital, the approach to some of our acquisition, more in a portfolio approach. There is a lot of goodness happening there. But I think to cut through the noise, and to help the services build better budgets that, sum together to be a more capable Department of Defense, Department of War, to meet the national security strategy, you have to set out priorities, and not everything can be a priority. And this sounds very basic, but you do find documents, and I specifically reference things like the defense planning guidance, which is a classified document, right? But just kind of the general trends that are present in that a lot of each individual call them kind of parochial interests tend to get represented, and everyone gets to add their do this and don't dare touch this thing of mine. Having lived it at a service level, when you receive that, there's usually at least a 10 to 1 of go do these great things, don't touch any of these things, and it leaves about $1 in nominal terms that you can move around. So I think a clear prioritization of what we're really trying to do, focused on outcomes, not systems. And that's one of the most important things, because you're able to have that, I think, that better discussion. We say, what are you trying to achieve? Don't tell me what system to use to do it. That actually gives you more trade space. So that if I had to pick one thing, I would really focus on aligning who needs to achieve what parts of the puzzle, and then judging people's homework based on that.
Awesome. I mean, you said something I think that would be very striking to anyone who doesn't work in defense, which is that, there's too many priorities and not enough money. And I think that, we have $1.5 trillion defense budget this year. And you wrote that, quote, improving outcomes is less about top line increases or sweeping reforms than about coherence. So is this problem of trade-offs and resourcing, is it eased by having more dollars, by having a 50% increase in spending? And if not, why?
So I think the problem is made worse by that amount of money.
Okay.
And there's several risks inherent in a roughly 50% increase in defense budgets of a $1.5 trillion budget. How much you structure in a baseline bill versus reconciliation or supplementals, all that kind of aside, it gives you the flexibility initially to not do those things. And that comes with tremendous near, medium, and long-term risks. So specifically, with large, rapid increases in spending, just like when you drive your car and you accelerate quickly, it is less efficient to do it that way. There will be inherent efficiency loss in the system with how that money is used because of what industry can absorb, what manufacturing capacities are there, how the services can actually bed it down and absorb it and actually turn into real combat power for the combatant commanders. There's inherent inefficiency in large swings in spending. That's a policy decision, that will happen between the administration and Capitol Hill on what we do as a nation there. But I think the longer term risk that concerns me And if you don't inculcate this way of thinking, of taking this very balanced, very rigorous approach to prioritization and bringing that coherence to our budgets, you will buy things now that we can't afford to own. Given that, depending on how you do the math, well over half, if not closer to 2/3 of the defense budget is really about people and sustaining things to build readiness. It's not about the buying of weapon systems or the research behind them, as I referenced in the paper, that roughly 1/3, 2/3 type relationship. So the risk right now is buying things that you can't afford to own, even at a higher budget level. But what we should all be concerned about is, not an economist, obviously, by trade. I think it's unlikely, based on our nation's economic and fiscal situation, that those budgets will sustain at that high level. And if, just like in folks' home budget, if you get a windfall of money and you go buy a bunch of new cars on a car payment and you realize you can't afford to own them long term, you could end up there in 3 to 4 years, probably, in the defense budget world. That potentially is a huge risk to readiness in 2030. And we need to be very diligent about that. And I think a lot of these recommendations and the discipline that goes with that will help best spend whatever amount of money there is, but certainly the higher levels, it's critical.
Tim, do you agree with Mark?
No, I think so. What I'll add is just a nuance to one of the things you touched on in the paper and mention it here is really, I think what it comes down to, right, is how we prioritize and address that constant tension between readiness and modernization, right? Like, what's the right? Because you look at the Air Force's fleet, for example, and I think you talked about this a little bit too. And it's no secret, it's that we have some airplanes that are 50 plus years old, right? So how do you make sure that we get to a better place on that front, but at the same time afford it over time, and be ready too, right? So how do you make sure that the crews that are fixing and operating those can remain at the level that they need to be at while you're doing that? I don't necessarily know what the right number is, but I think what you said is absolutely warranted with regard to stepping forward carefully. And it's going to be a conversation, right, between the Pentagon and Capitol Hill too, or wherever we decide to land. So,
And a little outside the paper, but I think as we're talking about 1.5 trillion, it's an important step right now in this town as we sit inside the Beltway right now having this discussion. There are a few things. I won't go into the full budget wonky side of things as far as what's in reconciliation and the dynamics versus the baseline, but there are some just structural things that potentially bring risk as some things are moved outside of a baseline that you generally assume you build on that baseline every year. The reconciliation, as well as the supplemental, is potentially year to year. You should really watch where the baseline moves, because that is a planning factor for how much money the department should plan to have in the future, that you grow by inflation or some amount of real growth on top of that. So that's an important piece to watch there. But another thing I think is really, really important as we talk about industry, and I read something about I forget, sorry, I can't quote the source, but I think it was this morning or yesterday. I read a piece or an article, something about like a 1,200% increase in our acquisition of Tomahawk, land attack cruise missiles, based on both the potential future threat as well as the expenditures currently in the Iran conflict. That is incredible. It's incredibly difficult. There's no manufacturing to back that up. The Office of Strategic Capital and a lot of folks at Department of War are trying to build that infrastructure, which is important. But if you're on the industry side and that happens for 1 year, that is not a good investment to build that infrastructure. So one of the things that comes with the reconciliation funding, and hopefully, depending how they structure a supplemental funding, is more flexibility to use that money over time. And then the discipline within the department, on the Hill, and within this or the next administration, to allow folks to use that money over several years, which is different than how most appropriations are used, to at least go to companies as they're making these contracts to show 3 to 4 years of regardless of future budgets, there's money available, is extremely important If there's pressure to spend it very quickly, you will only buy what's available, which is likely not what you need, and you will send the wrong signals and potentially damaging signals to industry and to particularly the capital markets.
So to that point, too, I think there's a real opportunity here where we're at to bring it around to economic statecraft too, right? As we send signals from a budgetary standpoint to the industrial base and the work that OSC and other entities are doing, right, to build resilience, right, domestically, and to work with allies and partners, right, to figure out how we robust our supply chains. There's an opportunity here to deliberately say, okay, as we as a nation make investments in these industrial base areas, right, and we send those signals, we do it from a broader view, right, and so we can improve our posture and therefore our advantage from an overall economic standpoint, and that's leverage, right? That is leverage in the long run. So and you know that it's thinking about it in a different way, in a more broader way, and in a deliberate way, and that thinking is starting to to happen in a lot of ways. It already is, but evolving that approach, I think, will help us with these broader goals that you hear from the administration, right? This one and the prior one, with regard to putting ourselves in more advantageous space, that again will help us from a leverage standpoint when we look at the use of economic tools as a part of statecraft.
Tim, I want to keep riffing off that and turn it back to you, Mark, on this topic, because you wrote in the piece that, quote, influencing small changes in the trajectory of private sector investments represents a de facto increase in defense spending. How feasible is that?
Yeah. Well, I think first I probably need to just talk about the dynamics at play
Yeah.
really quick, right? So, when you are inside the Pentagon, and you're a service and you try to get more money, there's only a few ways you actually do that. One is you make an argument for a bigger piece of the existing Pentagon pie. If you're in the Air Force, that means trying to take the Army's money and vice versa, right? I mean, that's the internal game of any bureaucracy. The other is you make a compelling case for more total funding, and whether that's through Capitol Hill, the administration for higher defense budgets. The third way is you get other people to buy down your bills for you, whether it's having the Army do something or the Navy do something so you don't have to do it, or in this case, aligning private investment that's happening to help solve your problem, to buy down the need for the Defense Department to have to do, say, long-term or even short-term research and development on certain things. That is a opportunity that has emerged, let's say, over the last 5 years, of the tremendous increase in investment in defense tech and defense technology from the private markets. So now let's talk about scale. I use the AI infrastructure example in the paper. You could probably say that is a kind of unique one-off. True, but there's a lot of other investments out there. So if we were to talk about, say, $500 billion of investment that private industry is doing, not all that necessarily in defense tech, and then you say, okay, so what if we influence that by 10%, by 5%? That is real money. So now we're talking about, say, somewhere between 10 and $50 billion of shaping that investment. It's good for industry because you're helping shape them to things that the department intends to buy. That helps them with better return on investment and helps them get better capital rates on the capital that they're seeking. But it also very much helps the defense. And now the things that you want to buy in the future are ready to buy, and you have made best efficiency of that money. So I say that to go to a 5 to 10%, call it, or even 1% slight change in the expenditure of that in that money is real money. $550 billion represents more than the Air Force's annual budget for research development. So you can just get a sense of that. So back to your question, I think, is it practical? Yes. I mean, it's not that hard, I'll be honest. And I think that is where trying to take all those signals that you're saying to industry and just make them a little bit better. Ideally, I'd make them a lot better. But giving them a source document, that's where I talk about demand signals, both from the Department of Defense, the DOW, and some of the work they're doing in the acquisition and sustainment side and A&S are doing some of these things, and they're starting to. And then from the individual services, just to give a better sense of where they're going, what's important, what's less important, what are the time horizons for those investments. I think I think the industry, and from my experience since I retired, industry is hungry for that. They would take that, they would use that to help their capital raises. So yeah, I think it's very practical to have an impact there.
So I know that there are some mechanisms for this to exist in some ways, like there are industry days that the services can hold or DARPA holds. And you even have like senior government officials in the Pentagon that get on LinkedIn, hop on LinkedIn, and they say, all right, this is like where we're thinking things are headed. What additional, I guess, demand signals do you think should be put out there in the next couple? Because I think this administration is very willing to work with industry.
So, um, agreed.
Yeah.
Done incorrectly, all of those examples are noise.
Okay.
Because industry doesn't know who to listen to, right? Because whether it's a person on LinkedIn or it's a person in an industry forum, in uniform, a civilian, executive inside the department, if they're talking in a sustainment forum, they're going to tell you the most important sustainment thing. If they're talking at a cyber forum, they're going to tell you the number one cyber thing. If they're talking to, whatever that, if they're talking to the surface fleet forum, they're going to give you a, perspective there on the Navy side. But who equates that across? Obviously, I bring some personal stake in this because it's what I try. What I was doing for the last 2 years was trying to bring this together inside the Air Force. And I think some of the demand signal we put out a draft demand signal. And I think you just have to do it. I think it won't be perfect. It's not requirements documents, right? But just beginning that dialogue. And now you don't necessarily have an industry day about this specific system. You'll still have those. You have industry days about helping us solve this problem. And hey, we can do it, a whole different ways we can solve this problem everywhere from special operations to cyber to high-end kinetic effects, but help us think through how to solve this problem. I I think you just have to cut across some of those verticals, and where you just tend to focus on one specific functional aspect of it.
Tim, do you want to jump in here?
No, I don't think I have much more to add than that. Aside from the very last point you made there. So I think it does. Yeah. So you lived it, right, and led through it. Solving the problems or sharing the problems, right? And then working with industry to solve those problems. Vice, here's a requirement. That's a challenging thing to do. Again, given bureaucratic inertia, where we've been as an organization, how the process is structured, right? But finding a good way, a central source to make sure that there's coherence to your point, above the noise, I think is probably to me the core challenge, right? How do you make sure you do that? And that's a leadership thing again. It's a culture thing too. It's an organizational incentives and accountability kind of thing too, right? At the end of the day, and not just in the building or the service, but that goes to to Capitol Hill too, and how they respond to the budget proposal and the details of it.
So while we're talking about Congress, obviously Congress is the one that actually sets the budget.
Yes.
Unfortunately, not the Defense Department or the White House or whatever. So who, like what kinds of conversations need to be happening with Congress? How can Congress also cut down on some of this noise? Do you have any recommendations for, any listeners that might be tuning in?
I do. I'm sure Tim does as well. So I'm going to go back to coherence. Um, Again, having been in some of these discussions, if you were on Capitol Hill, I think you would be very confused often by budgets coming out of services or the broader department because it would appear that priorities totally change from year to year. And it doesn't necessarily look like those priority changes are based on changes in the environment or the threat. Some are, but many aren't. And so they're surprised. And I don't think it is to anyone's benefit to have the professional staffers and certainly the members on the Hill enter into discussions about the defense budget and feel surprised. There will always be changes. There should be based on the context and the environment within which you operate. But I think that idea of the demand signals, of signaling what are the priorities, where are we going, they can see changes, they can understand the coherence and the logic of those changes, even if they disagree. But we have to prevent the surprise whenever possible. So I think enhanced communication, that is challenging. Many members of uniform inside the department don't necessarily look for opportunities to engage with Congress. I implore them to take the opposite perspective when they're allowed to do so, to build those relationships and just have those contextual. And I'd go so far as to say, like in a media sense, like the background. Just have the background, have the off the record discussions just to build the understanding, the shared understanding of the context before you just drop a budget on them. So I'd encourage that. And then those same types of signals that we're saying to industry. Congress is another extremely important, I mean, constitutionally, the most important, audience for those demand signals when it comes to budgets. So a consistent message of what we're telling industry, what we're doing internal building to build budgets, and then the signals the budget sends and how we communicate that to the Hill, they have to all line up.
Yeah, a couple things here. I think if the leaders from the building, as they bring their budget proposal over, if to bring it back up to the economic statecraft kind of idea here, if they can contextualize, right, the other broader societal like benefits, right? Again, when you're talking about achieving a more advantageous posture, what that means, based on what the budget proposal is, I think that'll go a long way, because members of Congress, they're not just worried about this, right?
They're
They've
busy,
got
yeah.
1,000 things on their plate, right? And this is one voice in myriad that are all vying for their attention and for resources, right? So helping, I think, contextualize like, hey, this is going to help not just, the Department of War get us the capabilities we need for the warfighters, which it is. How is this going to help move the country forward in a more broader sense? I think that contextualization will help go a long way. Something else that we've talked about on previous webinars and have been the point in some of the other articles too is how can we within the institution of Congress, right, change things or better things, right? How is this an opportunity to, you know, for committees to go across jurisdiction, right? Be it Intel, be it energy and commerce, right? Be it the finance committee. So how did the leaders within those isolated entities, which they are to a certain extent from a jurisdiction standpoint for sure, how do you better get how do you get to a better place for the country, using a vehicle like this? And to that end, as you all well know, and I'm sure that those that are listening know well, the National Defense Authorization Act is like for 5-6 decades, right? Is without a doubt going to be the only thing that always passes, right, or has been the only thing that passes through the Congress every year without fail. So, how do we get to a better place? Using that vehicle, using those conversations, not just from this lens, but from a broader lens.
I think it's reasonable. Sorry, man, one quick addition to that if you're a member of Congress with having lived these scars in the Air Force, with a base in your district, and the Air Force wants to retire or retire that aircraft, maybe with a different mission or whatever that may be, if there is not a consistent, coherent story they can take to their constituents, how would they support the Air Force? Or whatever the service, again, that is not unique to the Air Force. So I think helping to build that trust and give them a story and a narrative that's consistent over time helps get at some of the NDAA issues specifically, which tend to layer on a bunch of restrictions. Thou shall not retire this, you will do this. That decision space between the that $10 and $1 that we talked about earlier, some of that comes from Congress too, right? So I think that better communication, better having expectations set and preventing surprises helps eat into that and reduce some of those things that frankly put drag on the budget and allowing some of the transformation that you need to see, especially in the modernization accounts.
I always find this so interesting because a lot of, what I do day to day as I talk with people who see reindustrialization as more of a national project than just, a beltway project. And so I've always found this issue of coordination between Defense Department and Congress, of course, so interesting, but also, as you said, with local officials, with state officials,
Yeah.
who, these people live it more than anyone else in some ways. So it's always been very interesting to me. I wish we could talk forever, but I want to turn to the recommendations just quickly before we turn to Q&A. So you had 5 recommendations to sort of strengthen the signal to noise ratio among DoD personnel, but also industry. Your first recommendation was that we should incorporate economic statecraft guidance in the defense planning guidance, which you touched on before. So who should write this guidance? Who should be in charge of writing an economic statecraft guidance?
So I think the first, and this is the one that kind of touches largely things external to the department's control. First and foremost, you have to have a national policy, right? And so I defer to others and William Norris's article on this, right, previously in this series, that you have to link to something, whether it be in the national security strategy, the hierarchy of documents that influence this. So assuming there is a national strategy and you are understanding what the Department of Defense's role specifically in that is, there's many there's myriad documents that you could talk about. But I think the key one for budgets is the defense planning guidance, which really is the articulation of policy and how you should build budgets. Typically, that's built by OSD policy or OSW policy, the policy shop there, but often doesn't have a lot of consideration of the resourcing constraints, and it builds this huge disconnect between all the things you should do and the tiny amount of things you can stop, which drives essentially almost makes the guidance I won't say meaningless, but close to it, right? Because it's unachievable, so it loses some of its impact. So I think the higher level national documents directly impacting the defense planning guidance is the key step without changing a whole bunch of other systems of how you do that. And that really is predominantly a discussion with the policy shop there inside the department.
Awesome. And building off another point that you had mentioned before, that we need more defense-wide or service-wide published signals to industry, more documents. So how ambitious or cautious should those priorities be? Because, you can imagine a scenario in which the Air Force publishes a document saying this is a priority, and then, the next year things change. Capital has already prepared for that priority, however, and then there's some trust that's been eroded or lost. So what do you think sort of that tension there?
So I think they actually play a large role in building that trust because I don't think these demand signals are focused on we are going to buy X thing or X number of widgets. It's focused on these are key problems that we believe we have to fix to achieve the national military, the national defense strategy, and support of the national security strategy. So it's focused on problems. It's focused on outcomes. It's not focused on a specific weapon system or a specific acquisition program. So I think by building that, those tend to be fairly enduring. There will be changes, but if you base that on the constraints and restraints that you have both fiscally, with somewhat fiscally informed, and then also by the threat and the environment you plan to operate in, those don't actually change that much every year. How you fix the problem, how you address it could change based on new technology, a new startup that gives you an ability you didn't know existed, so you decide to do it with a non-kinetic versus a kinetic solution. That could change, but the underlying rationale, I think, will be fairly enduring. I think communicating in that way gives you an architecture you can communicate from that builds trust and helps with the expectations management piece, both with industry and with the Hill.
Tim, do you want to build on that?
I don't know if I can say it better than you just said it right now, though. So no, I yeah, I think we're in alignment on that idea.
So third recommendation, mandating a common lexicon and data field use across the defense budget process. So in your experiences, what would this change? I'm sure it sounds simple, but I'm sure it's really difficult. What would this change in practice?
So from my lens, a lot of times the discussion gets into billion-dollar IT acquisition systems to change to meet a somewhat bespoke need that the department has for how we do budgeting or tracking programs or resources. Not sure it's as bespoke as we think it is often. I am here just talking about simple mandating of standards and frankly, with a lot of the technology that's coming out, AI and otherwise, the ability to now kind of be database agnostic and do this at that meta level, it just doesn't have to be that hard. And if we just mandate certain fields that however it is you submit it, whether it's a standard data format, whatever that is, we don't have to change that stuff. Just say, hey, tell us what the key mission outcome this thing is tied to. Tell me the three top dependencies. Um, Tell me things that have a huge industrial constraint or the ability to are focused on adding industrial capacity, at least so you can filter as a beginning. And then when the folks who do that assessment inside the building or whatever organization, they at least have that starting point of understanding the connections between things. This is also extremely important as we want to bring better tools in, which we need to do, particularly things that bring automation or AI into this. You have to start building those connections between things. And now you start actually hopefully visualizing the defense budget, visualizing the outcomes, how things connect. And as someone removes a piece or it gets delayed or whatever happens, or there's a new opportunity, you now understand how it connects. So, but this is not a new $10 billion defense database that will fail and it won't meet the needs or the time.
This is I think, a really important point to have a common vernacular like laid out, right? And hey, this is where we're on the same page and understanding. So when I worked on Capitol Hill, I distinctly remember there was a point where my boss was talking about a bill, and he really said, he said words matter, and it was in this context, right? Like the way the definition of certain words are used, especially when you have an evolving or an emerging idea, right? That doesn't have a left or right limit necessarily yet, is really important. And then setting those standards early helps you, I guess, lead, right? Also, and set the standard. So again, there's an opportunity here for Congress, the building, the interagency to come together on when it comes to economic statecraft, what do we mean by certain terms, right? What tools, how do we define and wield tools, right? How do we look at those? That really matters. And I'll tell you what, the research that we've done here at the Potomac Institute over and over again, this is like on the projects that we do, something we always, it seems like, always come back to is, okay, what's the common language? And it's amazing to me, as simple as we might think it is, as simple as it actually is, it's not done early on, for so many challenges and problems that we have, or they turn into problems, right? Because this isn't done early on, right? And that's identified over and over again. So one of the things that we do consistently is, okay, well, where is everybody, seeing what the definitions are, so you can move forward from there. What's the common vernacular, right, and approach?
And this is something that's a great fit for this administration because the idea of building kind of a 3-year long consensus-based dictionary of how we're going to do data tagging, you never end up with an end product. I think there's willingness in this administration, this DOW, to just mandate something, put it out there. It doesn't have to be perfect.
Yeah.
We just have to make it better and start the journey. Same thing with the demand signals. They're not going to be perfect. Embrace them not being perfect. The feedback's part of what you're trying to do. And I think that's something this administration particularly can and should lean into to just start the process and make it better.
Yeah.
Sorry. No,
No,
so to that point, and we've talked about this in previous webinars and addressed it a little bit with some of the other papers, but DOW has been leading on many fronts on economic statecraft because of certain characteristics of the organization, and whether or not that is ultimately the right entity to do so. Essentially, we're still working through that, right? State has a huge role, Treasury, Commerce, they all have different roles, but DOW has invested a lot in it for a lot of good reasons. But from a planning perspective, right, historically, that's what they're known for, right? To your point about putting some guidance out there and then working through it, is that the right, lead for the interagency? I don't know. But given where they're at and how proactive they've been, that might be a great starting point. So, to get everyone on the same page.
So I want to turn to perhaps the most wonkish recommendation, which is a return to 2-year internal budget cycles. So for those less familiar with the budgeting process, can you explain, what happened in 2010 to shift from that 2-year cycle to what we have today? And then I'm just curious, is 2 years fast enough, given the level of iteration and invention that we're seeing in other conflicts?
So I think to achieve the outcome, 2 years isn't fast enough.
Yeah.
1 year isn't fast enough. I'm not sure 6 months is fast enough, but you still have to have a process on some annual or some type of cycle, right? So you need to give yourself enough flexibility so you're not waiting for the 1 year cycle. Because by the way, the 1 year cycle is actually a 3 to 4 year cycle, because as you mentioned, they're just doing 2028 budgets and about to wrap that up, right? So we're 2026, so you implement, so you kind of 3 to 4 year lag time there, right? So you need to build in enough flexibility, and that's why I talk about some of the tech transition accounts. We're working with the Hill to build trust. You need that initial flexible money now, but you don't need billions and billions of it, because you need the seed money to partner with private capital and things like that you can employ right now to keep those programs going, to bridge them. So going back to the question, on an annual cycle, honestly, you spend so much time in the process, you don't have time to do the actual analysis, and you're building documents. So I think you just lose a lot of time in the process, the things that aren't value added, to not doing the core analysis. You lead to quick decisions, expedient answers, not necessarily well thought and connected answers. And that's just trapped in that cycle. There's an interest, I think, to do them annually, especially from an administration's perspective, because they only get a few defense budgets that they get to actually impact, like 1 or 2 before they're actually out of office, or the next election cycle. So I think that is part of what happened, and especially back then, I think Secretary Gates trying to make the department more reactive, and align budgets to things happening, particularly in Iraq. But I think the flexibility of money actually would help meet both ends of that. So a little more flexibility on a piece of the budget, but then going to the 2-year cycle to drive better outcomes.
Well, I think you hit the last recommendation already, which was more programmatic flexibility. And I unfortunately don't think we have time for Q&A, but can I give you guys a quick popcorn closing thoughts? Just
Please.
very fast.
Okay. So I think first of all, great job on the article. That's seriously, and I think time couldn't be better. I just hope we take the opportunity moving forward to use this process, right, as a vehicle to help make sure that, again, we're in more of an advantageous place, right, as a country. It's looked at a more broader approach from the building, but then also from Capitol Hill. So when we think about the levers of economic statecraft that have been wielded more and more prolifically, right, the last couple of years, especially the last couple of years, we can put that into context, and again, put us in a better place moving forward.
Well, thanks again for the opportunity to both of you and your organizations for doing this, and for those who stuck with us for an hour of defense budget discussion. It all comes down to coherence. I think in building that coherence across our processes, across how we communicate, and then ultimately what we signal in our budgets. I think it's incredibly important. That's what we need to do to harness that asymmetric advantage of how we leverage kind of our whole of nation economic power to solve some of our hardest challenges, particularly those in the defense space. So I think if we focus on that and then use opportunities like reconciliation, like other things happening inside the department, we use those things to make it better. Don't focus on perfect, make it better. The risk of status quo is so much higher than we realize. So be willing to take those incremental risks, but make every step a little bit better. And yeah, if I can't, 1% improvement on $1.5 trillion budgets is a lot of money. So, and we can do a lot better than 1%.
I think that's a great note to end off on. So Mark and Tim, again, thank you guys so much for a very fun session. In 2 weeks, we'll be having our next webinar with Anita Kellogg exploring her article on operationalizing economic statecraft on April 22nd at 11 a.m. Make sure to keep reading War on the Rocks and make sure to join us in 2 weeks. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.